Welcome back to another edition of the Prepper Recon Podcast. Our mission is to bring you great interviews with preppers from around the world so you can be better informed and better prepared for everything from a hurricane to the end of the world as we know it. This episode is brought to you by CampingSurvival.com. Whether your plan is to bug out or bug in, CampingSurvival.com has all of your preparedness needs, including bug-out bags, long-term storage food, water filters, gas masks, and first aid kits. Check them out online today at CampingSurvival.com. Be sure to enter coupon code PrepperRecon for a 5% discount on your entire order. Today's guest is Trey Dawson. Trey is a senior instructor for the Appleseed Project. Trey, thanks for making time to come on the show today.
Oh, it's my pleasure, sir. Thanks for having us, Mark.
Absolutely. What is the Appleseed Project?
Project Appleseed is specifically a 501c3 nonprofit educational organization dedicated to maintaining the traditions and ideals of the founding generation. In order to accomplish our goal, we teach the true events of April 19, 1775, and rifle marksmanship in weekend clinics all over America. April 19, 1775, that is arguably the most important date in American history and sadly the least studied. Can you tell me what happened on that date, Mark?
I think it's when the British tried to march through Lexington on their way to Concord to confiscate guns and ammunition and the supplies of the colonists.
Absolutely correct. And if I ask 100 people that question, I'm lucky to get one or two responses as intelligent as yours. So consider yourself a rare man in America today.
So I got an
April
A.
1970. What's that?
So I got an A.
You got an A.
All right.
April 19th is the day of Polar Bear's Ride, the day of the shopper around the world, the day a bunch of Yankee farmers and shopkeepers were pushed into a corner and forced to make a horrible choice. Continue to submit to the king's ever-increasing appetite for the products of their labor, or fight, and in doing so, take on the most powerful military the world had ever known at the time. The sun quite literally never set on the English Empire at this time in history. So this is a bunch of farmers and shopkeepers taking on professional soldiers, picked men with virtually unlimited resources. It was a terrible decision to have to make. They chose to fight, and in doing so, they purchased at a cost of blood and sacrifice beyond our spoiled imagination the liberty that we take for granted today.
Wow. And how long have you been with the Appleseed Project, and why did you decide to get involved?
Well, like a lot of my fellow Appleseeders, I read about Project Appleseed in articles in Shotgun News, a publication many people are familiar with. They were written by a man who called himself Fred. I liked what Fred had to say. He and I were on the same page at the time. He was counting the icebergs that threatened our good ship, and so was I. But he had come up with an idea of how to fix what ails America. He believed that what ailed America had nothing to do with politics, but was in the hearts and minds of Americans, that Americans had lost their way, had forgotten their heritage, and by teaching them rifle marksmanship using the old Army qualification test and the true story of this day of great sacrifice, that perhaps they would get off the couch and get involved in their system of government in great number while they still had time. So I thought about attending, but the events in those days were pretty much all in Ramseur, North Carolina, tiny little town near Asheboro, about the middle of North Carolina, and they were 6 days long with a weekend event following. And I didn't, as a small business owner, I didn't have time, and it was too far away. I had plenty of excuses for not attending. And then one day I saw that one would be in Davenport, Florida, a couple hours from my house, so I realized that the time for procrastinating had come to an end if I wanted to continue to consider myself a man true to his convictions. So I loaded up my travel trailer, talked 3 buddies into joining me, brought 5 rifles and every accessory I owned at the time, all of which proved useless except one old Vietnam-era silent sling, headed out with little idea what to expect. It was January of 2007. Miserable day in what is nothing, little more than a cow pasture, well outside Davenport. And I learned more in those 2 days of shooting than I had in years of practicing on my own, simply because practice does not make perfect. I found out that day that that's just a myth we've all heard all our lives. Only perfect practice makes perfect, and that's precisely what they offered me at that event. I went on to attend a second event in February of 2008, where the shoot boss, a woman who went by Dragonwood, asked me if I'd ever thought about instructing, and I ate the red pill, and I've never looked back.
Wow, that's great. And what are the costs of the 2-day clinic?
We've got new pricing for 2014. The standard 2-day Appleseed event is $60 for adults and $20 for children under 18.
So that's not very expensive. I guess you mentioned that Appleseed's a nonprofit because they wouldn't be able to make any money at those prices.
No, and point of fact, if it weren't for the fact that we are an all-volunteer organization, and I mean right up to the founder of the program, Fred, none of us gets paid for anything. We put all our time in. About all we're lucky to cover are a little bit of travel expenses and lots of targets and T-shirts. Everybody who attends for 2 days gets a free T-shirt, hopefully in their size, and the rest of it comes out of the instructors' pockets and backs. And if we have in excess of 1,200 active instructors at this point, we run in dozens of events per weekend nationwide.
And then, in addition to the shooting clinic, you mentioned that you get really deep into the heritage of Lexington and Concord. How were the Minutemen able to get organized fast enough to resist the most powerful army on the planet at that time?
Funny you should mention, Mark. Today they have the term prepping, and I get a kick out of that. It fits right in with gun nut or bunker nut, maybe a little tinfoil hat club thrown in on the side. Well, in the late 1700s, our ancestors likely had a word they would use for what we call preppers today. They would call them good neighbors. In the late 1700s, if you didn't have the knowing and the doing of basic survival skills, and you weren't organized and prepared, you could count on a rather short life, because life always enjoys a certain number of crises. In terms of what they did on April 19th, King George III was an arrogant, isolated man. He was tired of the colonists complaining about the taxation. The aggregate total of the king's taxes were about 2%. They'd actually been repealed. The Stamp Act had been repealed prior to the first day of the Revolutionary War for independence. But the king was tired of hearing the complaining. He had already sent General Thomas Gage, to Boston to take over as a military governor, supplanting colonial rule. He had put Boston under martial law, and he had ordered General Gage to send out troops to confiscate powder and ball. This was called a powder alarm by the colonists. The first powder alarm was quite successful. It was easy enough to do. The colonists kept their powder in magazines, buildings outside of town. Black powder is very volatile. It's nothing like the smokeless powder we use today. The slightest static spark will set it off and make a horrible explosion. So that in order for safety, greater safety, they would keep it outside of town. The king's men simply rolled up with wagons, put the barrels on the wagons, and took off. Easy peasy. This much alarmed the colonists, and they formed the Committee of Safety, of which Paul Revere was a member. The Committee of Safety worked out an alarm network of riders, alarm bells, alarm fires, and musket reports months in advance of April 19th as a result of these powder alarms. The first powder alarm, as I said, was successful. He tried it 2 more times where he failed. There was a confidential informant. Historians believe that it was likely General Gage's own American wife. She was feeding information to Dr. Joseph Warren, who was passing it on to Paul Revere, who would alert the Committee of Safety. They would enact this network of riders and church bells and alarm fires and so forth, and the word was spread out across the countryside. In fact, on April 19th, in less than 20 hours, 3 men were able to get 14,000 men to arm and equip themselves and march toward Boston to what might well have been their death, what certainly would categorize them as traitors in the eyes of the king. There was Paul Revere, William Dawes, and a third man whose name has been lost to history. The revolution was not started over taxation without representation. It began over the confiscation of powder and ball. The colonists, by setting up this network, were able to prepare and move quickly. They had all mustered and they had trained on their muster field rather for months prior to this. You had men like Captain Isaac Davis, who trained weekly, Captain Parker, whose men trained monthly, and they were ready. You had 3 categories. You had Minutemen, militiamen, and alarm list. Minutemen were the young fellows, age 16 to early 20s. They were expected to be ready at a moment's notice to get their gear and go wherever they were told to go. The militiamen were in their early 20s to age 46. They were the regular militia, and then you had the alarm list. After 46, you were no longer required to serve in the militia by reason of age, but you were welcome to volunteer to protect the town. In point of fact, on April 19th, it was some of these older men, the alarm list, who were the most effective that day.
So in their minds, when they wrote the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, being in the militia, it wasn't some right that the government may or may not let you have. It was actually a requirement. It was part of your duty. It wasn't something that was written to go deer hunting or protect your home. It was a requirement to keep your area free from invaders. That's very interesting. Now,
I get a kick out of that.
The British on their way to Concord first marched through Lexington. Is that correct?
That is correct. Their orders were to go to the town of Concord because they also had secret information from Tories 5 that that people of Concord were stocking up military arms, that they were, stockpiling arms for some sort of insurrection or whatever, which was not entirely accurate. But the men they had to go through Lexington on their way to Concord. And when they got to Lexington, Captain John Parker, he got the alarm. He sent out some riders. One of the riders came back a few hours later, said he couldn't find any regulars about it, and the alarm was false. Parker dismissed his men, but told them to remain within the sound of the muster drum. A couple hours later, the second rider comes galloping in and shouts, "The regulars are not only coming on, they're halfway past the Rock, a well-known landmark not 30 minutes from town." So despite Paul Revere's timely warning, the men of Lexington were still essentially caught by surprise. Captain Parker then had William Diamond, 19-year-old William Diamond, sound the muster drum, and he remustered his men, about 60 to 70 fellows lined up in battalion order. Then Colonel Smith was in charge of the initial British troops coming out of Boston. It was a fellow in charge of the van, the three forward companies of the British column. His name was Jesse Adair, and Jesse Adair was a man who was known for quick action and slow thought, and not one to turn away from a fight. He saw Captain Parker's men lined up, and he spurred those three forward companies right in line with Parker's men. Colonel Smith, who was actually in charge, saw what was, Major Pitcairn. Major Pitcairn was in the rear, but he saw what was happening and spurred his mount forward, taking the remaining companies around the Lexington Meeting House over to the Concord Road. This was not part of their mission. He had no desire to engage. The problem was General Gage had been thwarted in secrecy several times. He was given orders on a need-to-know basis. Only Colonel Smith and Major Pitcairn were aware of their orders. Jesse Adair was not aware that their orders did not include Lexington. He saw armed militiamen. He brought the three forward companies right into them. This set the stage for a fight. They lined up. The regulars rather, started their deep-throated shout that was their fearsome trademark. Huzzah! 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 One of the British officers wrote later that the sound was deafening. Suddenly, a shot rang out, most likely from a pistol. Paul Revere later wrote in his diary that the shot that rang out sounded like a pistol to him. The only people carrying pistols were the British officers. It's hard to say where it came from, but the casualty list pretty much tells the story. Once that pistol round went off, the British began firing without orders. In the initial volley, they fired high, as soldiers unaccustomed to battle often do, but they quickly reloaded as they had been trained, and in the second volley, Captain Parker's men began to fall. Many remember Captain Parker's kinsman, Jonas Parker, standing with his hat between his feet, holding spare flint and ball and powder, declaring he would never run. Jonas Parker was killed in the second volley. After the white smoke of hundreds of musket shots had cleared, 8 militiamen lay dead or dying, with another 9 wounded. Of the 8 sets of fathers and sons, that turned out that day, 5 were separated by death. The militiamen were mostly shot in the back. Captain Parker, when the British started coming on, one of his men turned to him and said, "There are so few of us here, it's folly to stay here." But Parker said that, he decided that the time for debate had passed, and he said, "The first man who offers to run will be shot down. Stand your ground. Do not fire unless fired upon, but if they want a war, then let it begin here." But by the time the regulars came in sight, there were about 300 of them stretched out a quarter of a mile into the distance, and he realized he was horribly outnumbered. So he turned and gave new orders: disperse and do not fire. Unfortunately, by now, the British are already huzzaing, and a lot of his men did hear the order over the shout of the British, and some of them, I suspect, were just enraged at the thought of armed men coming into their towns and refused, to disperse. The only ones who returned fire that morning were the older veterans of the French and Indian Wars. But at the end, when it was over, one of the regulars got shot through the thigh. A private got shot through the thigh, but he wasn't wounded so bad that he couldn't continue to march. And we had the 17 colonists either dead or either dead or wounded. So I would say by the casualty rate, it sounds to me like the British fired first. I think if the militiamen had the opportunity to fire first, the casualty rate would have been a little more even. The next strike of the match, as we call it, takes place at the North Bridge. And when our men did fire with orders, in the first volley, they took out half the British officers. 46% of the British officers and 7% of the British enlisted men went down in the first volley, whereas our side took 3 casualties total during the entire conflict.
And the North Bridge
pretty big disparity.
And the North Bridge was when, after Lexington and the British regulars are on their way to Concord or on their way back from Concord?
They've actually gotten to Concord at this point and marched past Concord to search the Barrett and Buttrick farms because the Tory spies have told them that that's where the armaments were stored. They ransacked the town of Concord, kicked in doors, clapped pistols to people's heads, burned things. It was pretty bad. But then 3 companies continued on to the Barrett farm. Actually, 7 companies total. 3 went to the farm, 4 stayed at the North Bridge. The militia had mustered on Punkatasset Hill, and as they moved closer to their muster field, they saw smoke rising from the town. They couldn't see the town of Concord, but they saw the smoke rising and were forced to assume the British had put it to the torch. A young man named Lieutenant Joseph Hosmer turned to his commanding officer and said, "Are we going to stand here while they burn our town?" I mean, today in a modern army, no LT would ever speak to his commanding officer in such a tone, but this was the militia, a more democratic entity where every man had to say. And Buttrick, Major at last decides to move toward the bridge, and they start marching down toward the bridge, and they see the British lined up. They're marching down toward them in battalion order. At this point, they're outnumbering the British by 4 to 1. Makes the British very nervous. The regulars start tearing up planking on the bridge, which serves only to further anger the thrifty colonists because they had built the bridge. It's not like they went down to Home Depot and bought some 2x6s. This was a major ordeal to build this bridge. And then the British fired without orders again, showing the same lack of discipline they had shown only 3 hours earlier in Lexington. As men began to fall around Major Buttrick, he shouted, "Firemen, for God's sake, fire as fast as you can." And at that point, for the first time, the militia fired at the British with orders. The leader of the group, Captain Isaac Davis, was asked if his men would lead the march toward the bridge, and he responded, "I have not a man who is afraid to go." I mean, this was a bunch of farmers and shopkeepers. I learned in school that the British came with taxes. The Americans didn't like it. The militia came out. It was all good, and George Washington chopped down a cherry tree and didn't lie about it. That's just insulting. The level of sacrifice just on this day alone, let alone the 8-year war that ensued, is beyond our spoiled imaginations today. What these people put up with, what they were forced to endure, the choices they made, make modern Americans look pretty bad.
That's that's a very nice in-depth explanation of the day. It's not really in our heritage to suffer long under tyranny. Do you have a favorite? It sounds like you know pretty extensively about a lot of the characters from that day. Do you have a favorite character from April 19th?
You know, over the years it has changed. Initially, I guess initially it was Isaac Davis. Isaac Davis was a farmer and a blacksmith, 30 years of age, had a wife named Hannah. On the morning of April 19th, when he got the alarm, they had several children, and all of them were sick. 2 of them showed signs of the deadly canker rash, a mortal disease. We call it scarlet fever today. I mean, it often took out entire families at this time. And when Davis got the alarm, he and Hannah were distraught. But still, he went out and fought. When he was asked if he would lead, he didn't hesitate. He trained his men harder. He equipped them. He manufactured cartridge boxes, which allowed a higher rate of fire, and bayonets for each of the individual muskets his men brought to the table. Initially, it was Isaac Davis. And then I started to notice Hannah. We know a lot about Hannah Davis because she left a diary. She buried 3 more husbands after Isaac Davis, and she lived into her early 90s, I believe. She said that she had a bad premonition that morning that she would never see her husband alive again in this world. And it proved to be correct. It was Isaac Davis's last day on earth. She knew she'd never see him. In her heart, she knew she'd never see him again, and yet still she let him go. I mean, in New England in 1775, to lose a husband with a house full of sick children would have been a hardship of desperate measure, and still Hannah let him go. Hannah placed a high price on liberty, and on April 19th, Hannah paid in full. Then gradually I began to notice Captain Parker. Captain John Parker was a veteran in the French and Indian Wars. He'd fought valiantly about a little over a decade before, under the king during the French and Indian Wars. And but on the morning of April 19th, he had tuberculosis for quite some time, what they called consumption then. And I've looked into what it's like to die from consumption, from tuberculosis untreated. It's a god awful way to go. I mean, you have no appetite, you lose weight, you're hacking up blood all day and night, you can't sleep, your eyes sink in, you have no energy. He gets the alarm well after midnight, and rather than doing what any modern American would surely do, which is say, hey, I don't feel well, you're going to have to get somebody else to go, this man took his duty seriously. His townspeople had elected him to lead them, and they had chosen well. John Parker's the kind of man you can count upon in a time of crisis. He accepted his duty, and he dragged his sorry, tired, sleepless, unfed rear end out of bed to lead his men. And not only did he lead his men, he died 6 months after April 19th. He only had 6 more months to live. I mean, this man was in bad shape. Not only did he lead his men on April 19th in the morning, but after they got their rear ends kicked on Lexington Green, he re-mustered his men, got some new men to join them, and they moved to a spot along what is now called Battle Road, where he knew there would be a great spot for an ambush, and they waited behind granite boulders, some of them in the same stiffening, bloody bandages they'd been wearing since morning, waiting for the British column to come back to extract their revenge. When the British column came up, Captain Parker had his men wait with patience. They waited, in fact, until Colonel Smith, the leader, rode up in front. That's when John Parker stood and gave the order fire. They got off 2 volleys before the stunned British could effectively react, and before they sent Major Pitcairn to disperse them with infantry, Parker's men had their revenge. This spot on Battle Road is known to this day as Parker's Revenge. But the more I study the story and the deeper I get into it and the more characters I find, the more of them inspire me. There are so many different individual tales of sacrifice from that day. Samuel Whittemore, David Lamson, Prudence Cummings Wright. I mean, it weren't just hairy-legged men that wrested this country from the bonds of the king's tyranny. It was women and children as well. This was a team effort. It involved community. It involved preparedness. It involved grit. And it involved a love of liberty that knew no boundaries. These people, they would rather be dead than be slaves. I know, when I was a kid, I thought lots of things was important. My car, my job, my girl, whatever. But then I matured and I decided, well, health is the most important thing. In studying the writings of the founders and the stories of their lives, I've come to realize that health is not the most important thing to human beings or any other living creature. What good is it to be a healthy slave? Liberty is the most important thing.
that's very, very true. And, I would hate to see our country be put to the test today to see who would stand, for liberty. Can you tell us a little bit about what we would learn in the shooting clinic?
We teach the Army Qualification Target Test, which was invented shortly after World War I and abandoned about mid-Vietnam. The AQT is a bell-shaped target to represent a man in prone position. It's fired at 1, 2, 3, and 400 yards normally. We use a special version of the AQT that's shot at 25 meters or about 82 feet. We use reduced size silhouettes to mimic targets at greater distances, and we fire it from field positions, standing, sitting, and prone. There's 4 stages to it, maximum of 250 points. 210 or greater qualifies you as expert under the Army standards, or what Appleseed calls rifleman. We begin by layering on marksmanship knowledge. Some people have referred to it as the fire hose of marksmanship knowledge. We take 6 days from a rifleman boot camp and squeeze it down into 2. We start out with teaching you how to acquire a proper prone position. Then we teach the 6 steps of firing the shot: sight alignment, sight picture, respiratory pause, focus, squeeze, follow through. Then we teach natural point of aim, rifleman's cadence. We show you how to do the sitting position. We show you how to do standing. We teach 3 types of sling use: hasty, and loop sling, from the least stable to the most stable. We teach 4 different seated positions: cross-leg, crossed-ankle, open leg, and kneeling, and the reasons for all of the above. We can take the average shooter from a shotgun pattern, down to a nice tight group in 2 days if they bring a teachable attitude. I know it sounds silly and obvious, but, after doing this for quite a while, the most important piece of kit that any shooter can bring to one of these things is a teachable attitude. The rifle, the ammo, the mat, the elbow pads, water, food, all that stuff is great, but the teachable attitude is number one. Then once we take a break every now and again, we take a break in the morning, we take a break at lunch. During the breaks, we teach the true story of April 19th, the day of Paul Revere's ride, in 3 separate sections we call the 3 strikes of the match. And we go into some pretty good detail, and we tell it in such a way that makes it real and here and now, not just a bunch of dry dates and facts. I tell my own version of the 3 strikes in the present tense to try to make it, to bring the listener more into the reality of it. And I make comparisons between then and now. It's tough because what we learn in school bears so little on what really happened. Now, as far as the marksmanship aspect goes, we teach more about marksmanship than the Army does today. The Army does have designated marksmen. They have programs that are a little higher level, but I know for a fact from working with lots of military, I worked at Fort Stewart with National Guard, their marksmanship program is not nearly so detailed as Appleseed, simply because we're using one that was abandoned a long time ago, that was the distilled knowledge of thousands upon thousands of riflemen and hundreds of years of tradition. It's distilled down into a very concise system. By working at 25 meters, the feedback is much faster. You don't spend all your time, walking to greater distances on the line. And the reduced silhouettes are just like shooting targets at greater distance. It's a very effective and efficient means of teaching marksmanship.
And what type of rifle do you recommend to bring to the clinic?
It's best if you bring a semi-automatic magazine-fed rifle with at least 2 magazines that hold 10 rounds. Beyond that, run what you brung. It doesn't really matter what you bring as long as it's 32 caliber or less. No tracers, no incendiary rounds. You can bring a lever action 30-30. You can bring a Cricket single shot bolt action 22. You can bring Mosin M9130, the Gant 7.62 by 54R bolt gun with a clipper, stripper clip fed. We can teach you the basics of marksmanship with virtually any rifle. But if you want to be able to make score on the AQT and get one of those coveted rifleman patches for bragging rights later on, it's really best if you bring a semi-automatic magazine-fed rifle. One of the most popular rifles today is the Ruger 1022. Marlin now makes an Appleseed LTR or Liberty teaching rifle. They make a specific version. Comes with I believe it comes with a free Appleseed event certificate built right into it. It's an excellent rifle. It's the Marlin 795 model. The problem with 22s, they're cheap to run and you can learn most of what you need to know, but they cannot replicate the recoil and percussion of a centerfire rifle. So traditionally, the American rifleman is to shoot out to 500 yards, the rifleman's traditional quarter mile. This is what the AQT is based upon. It teaches a 4-minute of angle minimum standard. That means shooting within 4 inches at 100 yards. This allows you to engage a target out to 500 yards, the traditional rifleman's quarter mile. 22 runs out of gas at 200 yards, so you can't ever hope to become a true rifleman, a defender of liberty in the tradition of our ancestors with a 22. It's a great way to get started as long as you understand it's just a stepping stone to a centerfire rifle. You want to move to a centerfire rifle. There are a number of problems that the recoil and percussion of a centerfire rifle will create that you'll never experience with a 22. 22 is like shooting a BB gun. You can learn natural point of aim to some extent. You can learn the 6 steps of firing a shot for the most part. But things like flinch, buck, jerk, and blink, these come in proper positions, firm handshake, grip, pulling the rifle smartly, rear in the shoulder pocket, cheek weld. These are things that are designed to mitigate recoil, a recoil that a 22 just doesn't have.
And if you're planning on having a AR-15 or a AK-47, and that's sort of what you've chosen for your battle rifle for personal reasons, whether it's retreat, defense, or whatever purposes.
Sure.
Would you recommend somebody bring that rifle, even though it's going to be a little bit more expensive to shoot, because they're going to get that training with that rifle that they want to be trained with, and like you said,
Mark,
it's not really going to translate over from the 22 to their battle rifle.
Yeah, what I would recommend, if money's tight and you don't want to burn up a lot of ammo, I recommend you bring the 22. Shoot that Saturday morning, and then switch over to your center fire. You talk to a lot of people in the program; they would be more 22 oriented than I am. I'm old school. I have no interest in training with what I wouldn't carry into the field. And I guess you could say I'm something of a 22 snob. I do understand the financial impact. I understand the desire to save money, but I also understand that a nation of riflemen will always be free, and a rifleman needs a centerfire rifle, preferably a 30 caliber, frankly. But anything from 5.56 up will at least run rounds out to 500 yards. I mean, I know from shooting competition that an AR will put a clean hole in the paper at 600 yards, no problem. So it qualifies. But yeah, I absolutely would encourage you. You'll get a guy who says he's got 1,000 rounds and we might burn up 450 at an Appleseed event over a weekend, and he doesn't want to waste those 450 rounds. But my answer to him is, which would you rather have, 1,000 rounds you can't hit the broadside of a barn with, or 550 rounds that you're deadly accurate with? It's an investment. Marksmanship is a perishable skill. Most women bring an empty cup to the table and learn very quickly and do very well. Most men suffer from a number of things that impede their ability to marksmanship. Either they feel like they should already know everything, or they feel like they do already know everything, and sometimes it's a little harder for them, to get past that so that they can learn. But I don't care if you're an NRA high master or have never picked up a rifle again. I will guarantee you, if you bring an empty cup to an Appleseed event, you will learn something about marksmanship.
Very good. Excellent advice. Now, the EPA closed the last U.S.-based lead smelter this year. Do you think that's going to push ammo prices higher?
Yeah, I read about that. Initially, I was extremely concerned. I think the concern is not so immediate as it is long-term. I found out recently that all ammunition, for whatever reason, is made from recycled lead. The smelter that they the smelter that went out of business, I should say, to be specific, manufactures, of course, new lead. I think that may be an issue down the road, and I think in general it's a bad thing. I mean, we have gradually eviscerated our manufacturing capabilities. I'm something of a Second World War buff, and while it has nothing to do with apple seeds, on a personal level, people seem to think we won the Second World War because we were braver or smarter. The reality is we produced 8,500 B-17s in a very short period of time, and that's just a tiny vignette of what allowed us to prevail during the Second World War. And I'm always going to see it as a bad thing when we shift industry overseas. I think, while we may have concerns about environmental impact and pollution, we need to balance those with infrastructure and our ability to be self-reliant, because self-reliant is one of the traditions of the founding generation, and it's not just an individual tradition. It needs to be a national tradition. So I do have some definite concerns about the closing of that plant, but I don't think they're short-term. I think they're more long-term.
Yeah, we could probably see a lot of demand that was originally for other uses of lead that was originally on the new lead market could start to compete.
Exactly.
Could start to compete for that recycled market that's being used for ammo now. And that's a great point you made about manufacturing. Yeah, so World War II, all of Detroit, all of the car plants basically flipped over and were making tanks and planes.
Yep.
And do you think the large purchases of ammo by DHS and other government agencies, do you think they're adding to the shortages?
I know I've read that there's been a sharp spike in ammo purchases by military, law enforcement, and government, and this is something that's been taking place over a long period of time. I'm confident that is one factor that's affecting ammo availability. I think there's also the hoarding thing. A guy hears that ammo's scarce, so he goes into the gun shop, and instead of buying one box, he buys 5. The next guy comes in, sees there's a bunch of ammo missing. I think that has something to do with it. I think there has been some of the countries globally are buying up a lot of metals, lead and copper and so forth, driving the cost of same up. That runs the cost of the ammo up, which causes fear in the public. I think it's not a simple single point answer. I think there are a lot of things that have been driving the cost of ammo up and the availability down. Personally, I bought ammo a long time ago when it was cheaper, and everybody told me I was crazy and I was a gun nut, and then 2 years later they're wanting to buy it from me. This falls back to preparedness. If you're just now trying to buy a bunch of ammo, you're going to be encountering some problems. That's for sure. But it is out there, and if you persist, another one of the fine traditions of the founders, if you persist, it is available.
Yeah, and that's a good point. A lot of preppers are buying ammo as for one thing, in case availability doesn't come back around, but for also looking at it as a potential barter currency, which I would always want to give the caveat as, if you're going to barter your ammo in a stuff hits the fan situation, make sure you know who you're bartering it with, because you do not want to be putting ammo in the hands of your enemies after it hits the fan. But you know what? It's retained its value. It's made out of metal that has to be mined out of the ground and manufactured and produced. And so it's probably going to be a better store of value than, let's say, that dollar bill that's in your account that the Fed created by
hard goods always hold their value better.
That the Fed created by a keystroke. And
shovels, bullets, beans, those things will always have intrinsic value. Historically, every society that's ever used fiat money has burned in. The king had to come over. Rhode Island started printing money during the colonial times, and the king had to come over and buy it all up with gold to save the colony from ruin. It's nothing new.
Nothing new. And you were talking about World War II. I guess in World War I, we were selling a lot of those supplies to Europe, and they were paying us in gold, and we had such a great stockpile of gold. That's why after World War II, we were able to use the dollar as the reserve currency, because we could back it by gold in the Bretton Woods agreement. And of course, Charles de Gaulle wanted to change in all his dollars for gold, and Nixon had to close the window and essentially default on that global currency scheme. Actually, while we still have the dollar by the same name, it's not the same dollar that we had in 1970.
Well, as an Appleseed instructor, I can't comment on that, sir.
Sure.
But we can talk privately sometime.
Absolutely. And what are the requirements to take the clinic?
Teachable attitude, and you sign up on Eventbrite, or you can if there's open room on the line, you can walk up. But we don't really have any great requirements. I mean, we don't have a minimum age requirement. We have a minimum responsibility requirement. We also have adaptive Appleseed, so that people with physical disabilities can participate to the limit of their ability. We do our best to try to accommodate them. We get everybody from 8-year-old girls to 90-year-old men and everything in between.
And so the people don't have to go to North Carolina or Florida anymore. They're all over the country.
Oh Lord, no! Yeah, we've got 20 venues in the state of Florida, 15 or 20 venues in the state of Florida alone.
Wow.
You'd have a hard time at this point living more than 2 hours away from an Appleseed venue nationwide. I mean, we even have events in Manhattan and Hawaii.
And Manhattan. Wow.
In the basement of a gun shop in Manhattan.
I bet some people would be thrilled to know that was going on in their neighborhood up there. And of course we'll have links in today's show notes to the Appleseed Project, but for folks that are listening on Stitcher and iTunes, where can they go to find out a little bit more about Appleseed Projects and find out where they can attend a clinic in their area?
Well, let's see. If you go to www.rwva.org and click on Appleseed Schedule, there's a link right up at the top that says Appleseed, brings up a drop-down menu, click on Schedule, then you click on your state. It comes up with a map of the United States. You click on your individual state, and it'll bring up a schedule from that state with all the events, information, and a link to register. It's pretty simple. Right now I'm looking at, goodness gracious, we haven't even flushed out the Florida schedule completely yet, and we've already got 30-some events. I bet you we'll end up with 60 events in the state of Florida this year alone, or next year alone, I should say.
Very, very cool. And then real quickly, what does RWVA stand for the folks that...
Revolutionary War Veterans Association. Appleseed is an offshoot of the Revolutionary War Veterans Association, which began on the back of some napkins in a McDonald's in Ramsey, North Carolina. Very
cool. So we've got rwva.org, and then people can also get information from appleseedinfo.org as well. Is that right?
That's correct. Yep, appleseedinfo.org.
Very cool. Trey Dawson, thanks so much for taking time to come on the show today. That was just great information, a great history lesson, and I really encourage everybody to make time. 2014, make it a New Year's resolution that you're going to go get your marksmanship training.
Mark, I am honored and humbled that you let me on the show. We're running on a shoestring. We're just an all volunteer grassroots organization, and it's people like you that make it successful. Thank you very much, sir.
And thank you, Trey.
Hey Preppers and Patriots, my new book, American Exit Strategy, Book 1 of the Economic Collapse Chronicles, is now available in audiobook format through Amazon, iTunes, and Audible, Of course, you can still purchase the Kindle edition or paperback edition through Amazon as well. God-fearing patriots and those who believe in the Constitution will find this near-future dystopian novel to be right up their alley. Those who are looking to be more informed about the potential threat to America's financial stability will learn what to watch for and how to prepare themselves for an economic collapse. In Book 1, America is on the cusp of financial annihilation. Matt and Karen Baer face the challenges of Main Street during a full-scale financial meltdown. Government borrowing and monetary creation have reached their limits. When funds are no longer available for government programs, widespread civil unrest erupts across the country. Matt and Karen are forced to move to a more remote location, and their level of preparedness is revealed as being much less adequate than they believed prior to the crisis. American Exit Strategy uses survival fiction to take an in-depth look at the real-life politics and economics behind the issues that are likely to trigger a currency collapse or financial meltdown in the near future. American Exit Strategy is a work of fiction until it becomes history. God bless and happy prepping.